Now I will talk about evidence-based investigative interviewing, the way research shows that interviewing should be conducted. We know that, you could say that how you ask is what you get. So really teaching investigative interviewers to probe for information in a correct manner is the key. And one of the needs, or one of the things that interviewers need, is a realization of how memory works. They should probe for recall memory, so really ask the interviewee to remember as actively as possible and not go for what we call recognition memory, which again implies, showing a picture of someone and saying, is that the guy? This might be necessary sometimes in investigations, but this kind of recognition memory, which feels easier often for the witness, is much more prone to lead to errors. So if the police asks, did the guy have dark or light hair, the witness could actually be sort of tempted to answer light, although the guy might have been bald or just had a light cap or something. Whereas if they would have been asked, can you describe everything, remember about the guy, maybe that part would be left out, but the witness would be inclined to remember that he had 3 earrings in the left ear. And this information might be lost if not asked in an open-ended way. In the investigative interview, it is also known that to really acquire as much information as possible, we need time, a calm atmosphere, and also a sense of trust between the interviewee and the interviewer. And this, of course, might be a struggle in situations where resources are strained and there's a hurry to do the work quickly. But if you have a potentially really important victim-witness interview, you really have to give it the time it needs. Good investigative interviewing based on recall memory actually implies that people have to be allowed to sort of wander a bit in their memory landscape. So they might be talking also about things that are not crucial to the investigation, but since memory works in an associative way, although also the less important things might actually lead to things that then are really crucial. And it's very hard often to say at the onset of the investigative interview what road will take you to the most important information. It's also important for interviewers to be able to put up with silence. Silence, not in a coercive way, but really just showing that we have time, and I have time to listen, and it's okay that you have to think about how to phrase this, or that we can take a small break. We also know that trying to help the interviewee sort of reinstating the context, remembering as much as possible of the situation that they are here to talk about, really helps them provide as much information as they can. So they can be instructed to try to, for example, close their eyes and try really to think about everything that had to do with the situation. How it looked, how it felt, how it smelled, what they heard, etc. This is an element that is used in what is called the cognitive interview, which is one of the evidence-based interviewing techniques that is being taught in several countries. The interviewer also really needs to understand that having a stressed victim is not a good situation. Stress hampers memory. So if we want to help a person recall, we first have to establish a situation where the person is at ease. And this, of course, very much comes through establishing a good rapport or contact between the interviewer and the interviewee. And this can take time, in particular with, for example, victims of sexual trafficking. We know from research that they may be quite reluctant to talk about their experiences. We might never even get to that kind of contact, but we should give it time and really do our best to establish that kind of rapport. There are several methods of evidence-based investigative interviewing, of which the PEACE model is the one that is perhaps could be the base of any interviewing. And both the PEACE model, the cognitive interview, also the strategic use of evidence, which has been developed for interviewing suspects, they all build on this understanding of how memory works and how important it is to establish contact with people. And I would say that the generic things work both with suspects, victims, witnesses, including children. And also for children, the same is true. We need to help them remember, we need to establish a good contact, and these are really the most crucial things. Then techniques of what kind of questions to ask and not to ask are, they sort of follow this basic understanding. So we should not pose leading questions, closed questions. We should really try to ask in an open-ended way. And this also goes hand in hand with a realization that we should not base our investigative interview on predetermined assumptions. Of course, in a criminal investigation, we have a suspicion that a person has been the victim of a crime, but we should always try to remember that there may be other alternative explanations to the suspicion, or that the suspicion in itself may actually, the way it has been described, may differ from what has taken place in reality. A crime might have occurred, but not in the way it has been reported to the police, for instance. Because we know that if a person is really focusing clearly on in one direction, on one explanation only, we are really bound to look only for information that confirms this suspicion. And this also has an effect on the kind of questions we ask to interviewees, and the kind of information they then look for in their memory. This is a phenomenon known as confirmation bias, and it affects all human beings, be they experienced investigators or not. So the best thing we can do is really to be very concrete about this and try really to write down alternative explanations, make sure we look for evidence for and against all of them in an investigative interview. This is something called hypothesis testing, and in, for example, investigations of most suspected crimes against children, child abuse, it has in much of the literature, it has been recommended that these hypotheses are spelled out very clearly at the onset of an investigation, so as not to, by mistake, lead the child, give an account that might actually be false or at least lacking in detail. Another problem is that even if a victim has been victimized, is the victim of a crime, but all the questions, all the evidence that is gathered is sort of gathered only to prove this suspicion, it might be impossible to disprove other alternative explanations. So in court, if they cannot rule out other possible explanations behind the suspicion or the witness account, then a person is likely not going to be sentenced. So it's really in the interest of all parts in a procedure to look for all these alternative explanations, or let's say it's in the interest of the truth. In interviews, it's important to focus on central themes in the questions rather than small peripheral details. And this is because we are much more prone to erroring when asked about peripheral details. We differ very much in what kind of peripheral detail, less important details we find important. And this is very, very clearly shown, can be very clearly seen sometimes, for example, in child interviews. It's quite typical for adults to think they know what a child would remember. So the child is saying, this man asked me to come into his car, and an adult would easily ask, well, what color was the car? It might very well be that the child does not remember the color of the car, but being a child and the questioner being an adult, the child might very well be inclined to try to answer anyway. So they might say red because the mother's car is red or something. Instead, if the child is asked, can you describe the car? The child might say, as one child did, that there was a Donald Duck sticker on the back window. Of course, this is much more relevant for a criminal investigation than the possibly wrong color of the car. And this is something you can really, really see in investigative interviews. And personally, I think particularly with children, sometimes you can be rather surprised of the explicit details they can remember of things you would never have been, asking for. But asking open-ended questions enable them to come forward also with these. In In Finland, as in some other countries, we have very clear recommendations for how children should be interviewed. And there, one of the central features is the hypothesis testing, and really not to start by trying to collect information for an allegation, but really go through all the alternative explanations. And this can be highly recommended also in other situations. Interviewers are also recommended to use what is known as a funnel approach. So when you enter a theme or a topic of relevance, when you both know what you are there to talk about, then phrasing questions in an as open-ended way as possible to collect as much recall memory by the interviewee as possible. And then, of course, at some point it might be necessary to go into what, when, where, how, etc. kind of questions. These may be good, but not at the onset, not at the beginning of an interview. Most things can be asked about in quite an open-ended way. So if the child says, I went into the car, you say, can you please tell me about the car? Rather than saying, what kind of color was the car? And this goes for adults as well, for human beings in general. Children have sometimes been perhaps even too disregarded as witnesses, because they can be, in fact, very competent witnesses, but only if they are interviewed in a good way. And they are in a particularly vulnerable position when interacting with authorities. In younger children, it's very much due to their evolving linguistic and memory capacities, but also to the fact that they tend to be very suggestible. But also, and here I think, for example, adolescents are maybe even more at risk, because it's easy to see that small children are vulnerable. But if you have a teenager who has been committing some criminal offenses, they are very far from the perfect victim image. They can be very reluctant to interact with authorities and have severe trauma backgrounds and bad experience with authorities. Then it might not be understood how vulnerable they are. And in particular, again, if you think of, for example, the context of suspicions of trafficking, there are cases in which adolescent youth are being used to perform crimes. They are manipulated by adult criminals. So they may be perceived by the police as perpetrators and interrogated in a very harsh way, whereas it may be neglected that they are in fact victims of crimes and should be treated as such. So the appearance of an adult can be hampering their sort of situation and making them even more vulnerable. And also, of course, adolescents may have, they are developmentally also in a state where, for example, we know they are much more prone to making false accounts of crimes that they have not committed. So they might be more easily manipulated into false confessions by the police. In the interview, it is really important to look at to start with the pre-interview planning and preparation. So you need to find out things about the interviewee's background. Also think of how to address the topic of the interview. You may have situations where the victim does not even know that the police has information about their victimization. You might even have situations where the victim does not consider themselves victims of a crime, for example, labor exploitation. You also need to look at the victim's or witness cultural background and possible interpretation needs. Then, when you start the interview, the introduction is really important. Tell people why they are there, how this interview is going to take place, that it's possible to have breaks. Make every effort to make the person at ease in the situation. You go through the ground rules of the investigative interview, their rights and responsibilities, and these can be done in a very much nicer way than I think typically is the case. Very often they are just read to people and it may be very hard for them to understand them. However, they can be discussed slowly and surely, assessing that they really understand what they are about in a language that is easy to understand. And this might even be a way to establish a good rapport, a good contact. With children, it's been for a long time recommended that you use something called a practice interview or episodic memory training. And I would strongly urge to have something similar also with adult victims and witnesses. So really to familiarize them with the interview through talking about something else, giving a description of an event they have been experiencing. Typically, people are nervous about being interviewed in a criminal investigation, and it does help them remember if they are first allowed to talk about something that is easy to talk about, then it is easier to move on generally to something more difficult. But of course, people differ, the contexts differ. Somebody might come to the police station and being really eager to immediately tell about what they have experienced, and if so, then of course this should be listened to. And again, the substantive phase of the interview, where you actually deal with the criminal, the suspected crime, there you should focus on open-ended questions, invitations, and then go to more focused questions only after you have exhausted all the information possible through open-ended questions. And then, of course, make sure to have a good closure of the interview. The report is among the most important issues to learn as an interviewer, to really understand the importance of establishing a good contact. And there are instances where this is done very beautifully. This is an example from a Finnish asylum interview. We have many bad examples from Finnish asylum interviews. We have done a large research project on them, but this is a good example, I think, of an understanding of the interviewee's difficult situation. You don't have to tell us more than you can manage. We understand that you are ill and that you are having a hard time speaking of these things. You can relax. Everything is fine. We are here for you to look into your story, and you can tell us as much as you can. Thank you for telling us the difficult parts of your story. One last word of the investigative interview. In an ethically conducted interview, nobody should be forced to tell about their experiences. I think personally that a good way to see the investigative interview is really that we can give a good chance as possible for witnesses, for victims to describe what they have experienced, but we should never force or manipulate people into telling. This might just turn into yet another bad encounter with authorities and really hinder forthcoming disclosures of experiences of crimes. Thank you.